makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Today's video is about a tactic that I see used very often by the right, especially the far right, in basically making very vague claims about what the left supposedly does. But then when they are questioned who is actually doing this, they have no answer. They can't name a single person who's actually doing this. And yet, these claims become some kind of gigantic narrative that underpins a lot of the reason why people follow clowns like these. And I really think that if you're ever engaging with a right-winger who's resorting to these kinds of very broad generalizations, the single most effective weapon that you can use is name one person. Just ask them that. Name a single person who is promoting these generalizations. And most of the time they won't be able to answer. And if they do answer, it's like you can't get away with just naming one. Because if this is such a widespread phenomenon, surely you can mention more than one person. Like, there should be an entire cabal of people on the left who are doing what you're supposedly claiming is normal and commonplace among the left. So I'm going to show two videos that show this exact phenomenon. One of these videos was made today during a rather heated exchange on Ian Dale's show on the LBC, which if you follow British news and politics, you'll know what it is. And then this video ended up reminding me of a particular exchange during Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Zizek's debate a couple of years ago, which I should add, I think is the only public debate that Jordan Peterson's ever had with anyone on the left, which he consistently claims won't debate him, and yet they want to debate him, and they actively call him out for not debating them, but he still says that they don't want to debate him for some reason. Let's be honest, he doesn't want to be challenged on most of his views. So let's start with the LBC video. And so the main exchange here is between Darren Grimes and Paul Mason. Darren Grimes is probably one of the most punchable people in Britain right now. He's basically a young little vile fascist. He was involved in the Brexit campaign. He is just a horrible little snot. And the person he's having an exchange with is Paul Mason, who's a well-known Guardian columnist. He writes good stuff. And so let's watch what goes on. And this, basically the claim that Darren Grimes makes is shocking even to Ian Dale, who is conservative, and yet even what he says is like abhorrent. So let's watch.
But I think for a lot of people around here, right, there's this idea that the Labour Party not only doesn't like its country, it actively hates it. It sneers at those who quite like the flag. It sneers at those whose values...
Sorry, that is going way over the top.
No,
I'm
afraid to
political
say that's what
party
people
hates
believe.
its
That is
own
what people
country.
What's the evidence for this? What's the evidence? Or is it just another piece of disinformation from the Donald Trump-loving turning point?
I'm not involved with turning point, so I don't know where...
You kind of are, or were. Maybe you were no longer involved with them, but when Turning Points UK was formed, there you go. That's Darren Grimes. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there's so much infighting that he decided to quit, because these groups always tend to kind of implode, and they all look like complete total jackasses. Like, what is it about these young Republicans and young conservatives that just look like complete assholes already in their teens or early 20s? But there you go. So he was definitely involved in Turning Point USA. He should not disown that so flippantly.
that's come from, Paul. It just shows you've got your facts right.
No, what is the evidence? What is
the evidence is that you all sneer at whenever we fly our flag.
Give us a name.
Give it momentum. Do it all the time, sneering at the flag, and you're heavily involved with that lot, aren't you? More commie than Corbyn.
What? Say again, please.
More commie than Corbyn.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
What does it mean that I spread disinformation in a Trumpian way? These things are...
That's literally what he's been doing so far in this interview. He's basically making a massive claim that basically the entire Labour Party hates Britain, hates the flag, sneers at patriots, whatever, and he can't even name one. He's being challenged, like, give a name, show some evidence that this is the case. Like, that is Trumpianism. That was basically the hallmark of the 4 years of Trump in power, basically blaming the left, blaming the Democrats, blaming anyone who he doesn't like, without actually backing up any of those claims. So yeah, this is the playbook of Trumpianism, and more importantly, it's the playbook of the far right, as I will explain at the end of this video. But by the way, I paused that video at just like the perfect moment. I think nothing represents Darren Grimes better than that shot right there. Just, you know, an angry lad. He's repugnant in every way.
Just did it again.
And nonsense.
So look, give me the name of somebody in the Labour Party with authority who has in any way sneered at the flag of the United Kingdom.
Well, now with authority, look, you had the MP for Brighton.
You can tell that he's slipping now. Like, he was very confident when he started making that claim, but now he's yeah, the mask is slipping. And a good job by Paul Mason on just like hammer. This is what you should do in a debate, and I should say, as someone who has a lot of experience in debating in the real world, when you have a point, just hammer it. When you can tell that your opponent doesn't have an answer, hammer it until they concede. Don't let them like budge from that point. Hammer it all the way, because that will expose their inability to answer that question. Don't let them switch the topic. That is probably one of, if not the most effective debate tactics you can use. Just hammer a point that you know that you're right and that you can tell that they have no answer to.
In Brighton, I can't remember the name of the constituency, who, when Keir Starmer had the Union Jack behind him, sneered at the fact that he was doing that. It's seen as the Labour leadership, it's seen as pandering to jingoistic tendencies through up and down the country.
That's not sneering at the flag. That's merely pointing out that what Keir Starmer is doing is effectively just pandering. Like, it's not an honest display of patriotism. That's I think a very fair critique. That's not sneering at the flag in any way.
This is nonsense. When Robert Jenrick had the monarch behind him, there were, of course, Labour activists and all the rest of it saying that this is ridiculous. The most popular monarch in goodness only knows how long.
Okay. Hold on a minute. You are allowed in this country to be a Republican. I am a Republican.
Right, I didn't say you weren't.
No, I am a proud British citizen, but I wish this country was a republic. But that doesn't mean I'm
but most people disagree with you, though, Paul. That's the thing.
No, but we're not talking about...
Who cares? It doesn't. That's so funny. This is like such a fascist mentality that, well, the majority of people are not Republican in support the monarchy. So therefore, you're like the oddity. And yet, when it's whenever there's like issues of like cultural support for, I don't know, trans people, whenever the majority supports things like that, that's immediately dismissed. Whenever any leftist issue is supported by the majority, it's dismissed. It's not taken. Like, why are you believing? Like, what does a survey have to do? What does a poll have to do? But then when some right wing view is held by the majority of people, then they use that as an argument. It's huge double standard. And again, when they use a point like this, like, always have in your mind some issue that a very like heartfelt leftist issue, like in the US, for example, Medicare for all, or some form of universal health care, which the majority of Americans want to have. That's the moment to bring that up. And it's like, well, why don't you support something like this?
Disagreement, we're talking about sneering. And so the point is, it's not unpatriotic of me to say I would prefer that we had an elected president rather than Her Majesty the Queen. It doesn't mean I don't stand up for the national anthem. It doesn't mean that I would in any way sneer at, calling, for example, the royal yacht after the Duke of Edinburgh. I'm in favour of all of that. But so what I'm trying to track down is, you make an assertion, and it's an assertion that you throw in, and then you call us the media class. But really, the assertion has no basis in fact, does it?
What, unlike your assertion that the Tories are for the rich, when actually 14 million people voted Tory in 2019, and let me tell you...
That's the stupidest argument that you can possibly say. Like, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, of course right-wing parties are for the rich. They are for elites. And they've made people buy into that. Or people voted Tory not necessarily because they are the party of the plutocrats, but because they supported a lot of cultural issues that these like working class people who voted Tory believe in. So there's nothing incongruent about this at all. In fact, there was a recent study by Thomas Piketty, which maybe I should do a video on that, which basically shows that over time, like since the 70s to now, right-wing parties have shifted from basically previously they were the parties of the elites and the most educated, whereas now they are the parties of the elite and the least educated, which you can draw some conclusions on income. So just because 40 million people voted for the Tories, that including the bulk of which are definitely not rich, does not mean that the Tories are not the party of the rich.
This council house that I'm in right now, that my mum bought under Margaret Thatcher's right to buy.
Oh, by the way, the best part of this video is he's basically 27 years old, and he lives with his mom by his own confession. I know he looks like he's had like delayed puberty, but it's really funny that he basically saying that he lives with his mom at age 27. These right wingers who are all about individual responsibility and working hard, and dude, you're scrounging on your mom, and you're probably making a bucket load of money because groups like Turning Points are very well funded by very rich people, by libertarian donors. They have bucket loads of money, unlike left-wing organizations which don't have libertarian billionaire sponsors. He must be making a lot of money. He has a lot of followers. He was in the Brexit campaign. I'm sure he was paid very well. How on earth are you not, like, what kind of a loser are you that you probably have made so much money and you're 27 and living with your mom? Sheesh.
Is not the sign of someone who is for the rich or voting for a party that is for the rich. That was a ridiculous thing to say.
The party has historically represented big business in Britain. Eh?
All right.
And the Labour Party now represents middle-class activists like you, Paul.
Okay.
There we are.
There you go. That was good. Anyway, honestly, if anyone takes Darren Grimes seriously, you have brainworms. Like there's no other explanation for that. This video reminded me a lot about, and like I said, very good job, at least in the first part of the exchange, that Paul Mason basically just hammers him on the issue of, like, name a single person. And he didn't really name any. I mean, he mentioned two people on rather related but not specific to what he was referring to. So this reminded me of another, perhaps much more famous debate, which was Slavoj Zizek and Jordan Peterson. And there was a moment in the debate where this is a debate that's sort of hit and miss in many ways. I think the opening exchanges from both were pretty bad, but then it got better during the direct replies to each other, the more free-flowing section of the debate. And I strongly recommend that you watch it one day, that you have an hour or two to spare. But there was one point that I thought was the highlight of that debate. And if you follow Jordan Peterson and what he represents, you will know that one of the phrases that he most often brings up is post-cultural neo-Marxists, a term which I think he invented. I'd never heard of it before. I mean, I've heard of postmodernists and I've heard of Marxists, but postmodern cultural neo-Marxist, I think that framing is unique to Peterson. And he basically ascribes it to everyone who does identity politics or is on the left in any way. And so Zizek basically asks him, name a single person. I mean, because you can throw this around to like campus activists, but who cares about those? Like surely if this is such a threat to Western civilization, as Jordan Peterson claims it is, a threat to Judo-Christian culture or whatever, to liberalism, to his classic British liberalism that he follows, surely you can name certain people in positions of authority who promote this ideology, which I should add you haven't defined. And in many ways, as Zizek will say, is actually a bit contradictory, because the accusation that Peterson gives, that these people are mostly defined by their identities, is something that Marx would never have agreed with at all. Like, it's fundamentally anti-Marxist. So let's watch this. I'm going to speed it up a bit just because they talk a bit slow, and I don't want to see the whole. And I'm going to speed like the middle part a lot. So apologies to Slavoj Zizek, because his normal odd speaking cadence and his weird tics will look even more exaggerated than they already are. But let's watch anyway.
You mentioned, first, do you really, where did you find the data that I simply don't see it? Okay, let me begin by this. You designate your, under quotation marks, I'm not characterizing here, enemy, or what you are fighting against, as sometimes you call it postmodern neo-Marxism. I know what you mean. All this, from political correctness to these excesses of whatever, spirit of envy, and so on and so on. Do you think they are really, where did you find this data? I don't know them. I would ask you here, give me some names or whatever. Where are the Marxists here? I don't know any. Who is a Marxist here? Show me any big names of political correctness. I think they fear like a good vampire fears garlic. This is why they are already, the one who is not a Marxist, but at least approaches economic topic, Bernie Sanders, he is already under attack as white male and all that stuff and so on. My problem would be with this one. What you describe as postmodern neo-Marxism, where is really the Marxist element in it? They are for equality. Sorry, where? They are for equality at these cultural struggles, proper names, how do we call each other? Do you see in them, in political correctness and so on, any genuine will to change society? I don't see. I think it's a hyper-moralization, which is a silent admission of a defeat. That's my problem. Why do you call, it's not a rhetorical question for politely saying you are an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about. It's simply, I would like to know, because you, and I like this often, when you attack somebody, you said aggressively, and what should? Read more, tell me, whom. So I'm asking you now, not read more, I don't advise you, but who are? Give me some names and so on, and who are these postmodern, egalitarian, neo-Marxists, and where do you see any kind even of Marxism? I see in it mostly an utterly impotent moralization. Please, I'm so sorry that I was...
No, that's no problem. Please. Well, I mean, organization like Jonathan Haidt's, what's it called? Heterodox Academy and other organizations like that have documented an absolute dearth of conservative voices in the social sciences and the humanities, and about 25%, according to the what I think are reliable surveys, approximately 25% of social scientists in the U.S. identify themselves as Marxists. And so there's that.
But where are the
Well,
results?
okay, but
Can you name me
let's go
one?
to-
I know a couple of Marxists. For example, who does very solid economic work.
Yeah.
I don't totally. David Harvey. One, but he writes very serious books of economic analysis and so on and so on. Then there is the old guy who is far from simplification, Frederick Jameson and so on, but they are totally marginalized today. In this politically correct mainstream, you know, I don't see.
Well, yeah, your question seemed to me to focus more on the peculiar relationship.
So notice how Peterson, who is usually very, he tries to follow his own advice of, stand up with your shoulders straight and make your bed and whatever. And he's struggling to even look directly at Zizek, which in other exchanges that he's had, even like very heated ones and heated interviews, he's always looking at the other person. So he's definitely trying to weasel out of this answer. And note that what he said, he's like, well, he's claiming that all these social science departments are full of Marxists. Well, Jesus Christ, if they're full of Marxists, you should have tons of examples of this. No shortage of examples of this. Dude, you work in a fucking university. And if it's true, then you should be surrounded by, you should have no shortage. That should be a question that you could answer like this. Like, here's a list of, just in the University of Toronto, where I work, here's a number of, because he's claimed that he's been attempted to be cancelled or fired or something for his views in his own university. So how do you not have a single name? It's insane. It's absolutely insane. This, by the way, for me was the highlight of the debate, because this was like the number one gotcha. And I'm surprised that no one in any previous interview has ever done this before. And Zizek is not like a great debater or a great speaker. I like his stuff. He's funny. But he's not like a YouTube debate bro in any sense. But this was just such a good gotcha.
That I've noticed and that people have disputed between postmodernism and neo-Marxism. And I see the connection between the postmodernist types and the Marxists as a sleight of hand that replaced the notion of the oppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie as the oppression by one identity group by another.
Totally agree with you.
Okay, so so now look, we could
But
have
that's precisely a non-Marxist gesture par excellence.
well, I guess that's where we might have a dispute, because I think what happened, especially in France in the 1960s, is as the radical Marxist postmodern types like Derrida and Foucault realized that they were losing the moral battle, especially after the information came out of the Soviet Union in the manner that it came out. That the whole bloody Stalinist, the whole Stalinist catastrophe, along with the entire Maoist catastrophe, but they didn't really have a leg to stand on. And instead of revising their notion that human history, and this is a Marxist notion, should be regarded as the eternal class struggle between the economically deprived and the oppressors, they just recast it and said, well, it's not based on economics, it's based on identity, but it's still fundamentally oppressor against oppressed.
That's not unique to Marxists, like, at all. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Bible, which, by the way, he refers to. He's basically a very odd Christian. He's a Christian who never has straightforwardly answered whether he believes Jesus Christ exists or whether God is real. He uses basically just the Bible as a metaphor. But you can go back to the Bible and basically interpret the Bible as a story of oppressor versus oppressed. I mean, if you want to go even back and start framing Western civilization as a Judeo-Christian struggle, I mean, Christianity during its first 300 years of existence was basically a struggle between oppressor and oppressed. The history of Jews throughout, until quite recently, has basically been that relationship between oppressor and oppressed. I mean, you can frame this is not unique to Marxism in any way. So the issue here is that he just tags these things together because he wants to attack Marxists. He wants to attack the economic left, but also he wants to attack the cultural left. So what a convenient way to just band them together and invent this concept of postmodern cultural neo-Marxism, when clearly he doesn't realize that they're incompatible in many ways. And precisely because of this non-specificity of oppression as being inherently Marxist, you just can't play that game.
And to me, that meant that they smuggled the fundamental narrative of Marxism and many of its goals back into the argument without ever admitting that they did so. Now, I've been criticized, for this supposition because people who are post—
Yeah, because it's fucking stupid. Like, that is probably one of my major critiques against one of my major, because I have many. Like, fundamentally, this man's worldview is really fucked up. I would make a debate on a video on Peterson, but there's already some really good videos on YouTube. I don't know what I would add to some of the really good ones. The one done by ContraPoints is really good. I think that's one of my favorite videos of all time on YouTube. It's really, really good. But there's many others.
Modernists say, look, one of the hallmarks of postmodernism is skepticism of meta-narratives. It's like, I know that perfectly well. And I also know that Marxism is a meta-narrative, and so you should be able to be a postmodernist and a Marxist. But I still see the union of those two things in the insistence that the appropriate way to look at the world is to view it as the battleground between groups defined by a particular between individuals defined by a particular group identity, so that the group identity becomes paramount, and then the proper reading is always oppressor versus oppressed. With a secondary insistence that's very similar to Marx's insistence upon the moral superiority of the proletariat, that the oppressors are by definition, because they're oppressed, morally superior. And there's the call for perhaps not revolutionary change, although that comes up about, but change in the structure so that that oppression disappears, so that a certain form of equality comes about. Now, you argued that Marx wasn't a believer in equality of outcome.
Now, we're already at the 6, almost 7-minute mark of this video, and he still hasn't named a single person, which really was the question that Zizek asked at the beginning.
And I'm not so sure about that.
I'm going to speed it up a bit more.
His notion of the eventual utopia that would constitute genuine communism was a place where all class divisions were eradicated. So there's at least, well, there's at least an implication that the most important of the hierarchies had disappeared. And so maybe he had enough sophistication to talk about other forms of hierarchies. But if that's the case, then I can't imagine why he thought that the utopia that would emerge as a consequence of the elimination of economic hierarchies would be a utopia. Because if there were other forms of hierarchies that still existed, people would be just as contentious about them as they are now. Like we have hierarchies of attractiveness, for example, that have nothing to do with economics or very little to do with economics, and there's no shortage of contention around that or any other form of ability. And so that's why I associate the social justice types who are basically postmodernists with they're postmodernists with Marxism. It's the insistence that you view the world through the narrative of oppressed versus oppressor. And I think it's a catastrophe. And you appear to think that's very well.
Just one sentence, and then you can reply. It's so strange that you mentioned, for example, somebody like Foucault, who, for me, are you aware that his main target was Marxism? Okay, for him represented his game was never a radical change, and this is what I don't like in this, what you call postmodern, let's not call them Marxists, but revolutionaries.
I also think that Peterson doesn't really read his sources well. I mean, he misinterprets a lot of what Marx says. I mean, even in this debate, his opening statement was criticizing the Communist Manifesto. That's it. As if the Communist Manifesto was the summary of Marxist thought, which it's ludicrous, like absolutely ludicrous. I mean, if you're going to quote one major work for an economic debate on Marxism, because this debate was originally about capitalism and economics or something like this, you would start with Capital. Obviously, it's a big book, more than one book, by the way. But if you're such a vociferous critic of what you are opposing, you should read theory. You should really read these things. So I also don't think he's read much of Foucault either.
Enjoying your own self-marginalization. The good thing is to be on the margin, like not in the center and so on and so on. It almost made me nostalgic for old communists who at least had the honesty to say, no, we don't enjoy our marginal position. We want to do something central power. I find so disgusting.
It's no wonder you don't get invited to lots of places.
Yeah. No, Foucault for me embodies.
Let's make a joke so people forget how I'm being utterly owned in this debate.
This logic of revolution, and by revolution he meant any social change serious, that small resistances and so on, small marginal places of resistance and so on and so on. So, okay, but let's maybe drop it here if you want, but since you are replying to my question, you should have the last word here.
No, I'll stop with that. Let's move to the next. We'll get back to these topics, no doubt, as we.
Oh God, what a coward! What a fucking coward! Jesus Christ! I mean, if someone's giving you the last word in a debate on a question that you should be able to answer, and you pass that opportunity, what a fucking loser! And that is the problem. He didn't have an answer to that original question. He couldn't name a single person in this gigantic, horrible, Western civilization destroying cultural neo-Marxist ecosystem. Not a single person. Just like Darren Grimes could not mention who were all these labor leaders sneering at the flag. That's why I think this is such a very effective debate tactic. When they make a generalization that way, ask them to name someone, and they'll really struggle. And I was going to mention Jews, because this is a common strategy by the right to demonize any group that they don't want, that they don't like, whether it's the left-wing party, Labor, as Darren Grimes did, or it's all these lefties that you hate, that Jordan Peterson has been made famous for opposing. But it's also very much the same tactic that was used by anti-Semites back in the day. And a good example of this is the very famous, or should I say infamous, The International Jew. This was a series of 4 very long essays published in, this was the Henry Ford's, so this was written, I think this was written by Henry Ford, or for Henry Ford. He was a massive anti-Semite, by the way. And they were published in the 1920s. And I'm sure a certain someone with a funny mustache across the Atlantic read this. I'm pretty sure. And it's basically just a stream of consciousness of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and arguments. And I don't think I have the stomach to read the whole thing, but I have skimmed through it. And guess what? In the sort of 70, 80 pages of this piece, there is not a single Jew being named. Like, the International Jew, this cabal of Jews controlling everything in the world, and you wrote a 70-page essay and couldn't name a single one. I think the only one that he names is the former British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli from the 1860s. That's the only person who's named in this gigantic anti-Semitic rant. So, again, why do I mention this? Because that is the strategy. Generalize your opponent. Do not point at individuals, which is very ironic because that's exactly what these people always fall back on when it comes to like discussing racism. They don't like, say, critical race theory, which is right now the main talking point circulating among the right. They don't like it because it generalizes a systemic issue. They'd like to see racism as merely an issue of individuals committing acts of racism. Not that there's any structural racism at all. So the stuff that they don't like, or rather the stuff that they would like to keep going on, like racism, they want to point that as an individual problem, not a structural one. But then when it comes to attacking their enemies, they just invent these broad generic narratives that the Labour Party is anti-British and anti-patriotic and sneers against real good old working class patriots, or these postmodern cultural neo-Marxists who control academia, and yet you're in academia and you can't name a single one. Or this cabal of international Jews, which again, you can't name a single one. In 80 pages, you can't name a single, some Jewish person in a position of power that you think is, and you can like describe how this person or this group of people are actually controlling the world as you're claiming. So, I repeat, the whole point of this video really is to be aware of when this narrative is being used rhetorically, and when it is being used, the single best weapon against it is do what Paul Mason did, do what Slavoj Zizek did. Name me one. And they won't, because they can't. So, on that note, I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please like, please comment, please share, please subscribe. Had a huge jump in new subscribers, which I'm very grateful for. So thanks for enjoying the content, and there is more to come. Thanks.